What is the shape of experience? The title is a provocation more than a label. It asks you to treat your own conscious life, not as a private theater, where sensations play to an audience of one, but as a structured phenomenon with contours, pressures, gradients, seams, and attractors. Something that can be described with the same seriousness we grant to tectonic plates, immune systems, or the orbital mechanics of planets. If that sounds like category error, notice how quickly the phrase, "what it is like," becomes a dead end in ordinary speech. We talk about what it is like to be in love, to grieve, to feel shame wash over us, to lose ourselves in flow, to wake from a dream and carry a residue of unreality into the day. The like is not a confession of mystery, it is a placeholder for structure we have not learned to name. The wager of this book is that experience has a shape because existence has a shape, and consciousness is not an exception to causality, but one of its most elaborate interiorizations. The wager is also that the most powerful way to understand ourselves is not to flee from abstraction into sentiment, nor to flee from lived texture into sterile mechanics, but to build a vocabulary that makes the texture and the mechanics identical in reference, the same thing seen from the inside and from the outsides, at different resolutions. Begin with the simplest claim that does not collapse into nonsense. To exist is to be different, not in the sentimental sense in which every snowflake is special, but in the operational sense in which a thing is distinguishable from what it is not, and in which that distinguishability can make a difference to what happens next. If there were no differences, there would be no state, no configuration, no information, no trajectory, nothing to point to, nothing to separate, nothing to preserve. Existence, in any non-trivial meaning of the term, is a pattern that is not the surrounding pattern. It is a boundary that does not immediately dissolve. It is the persistence of a distinction. The moment you accept that, you have already stepped onto the bridge that takes you from static structure to causal structure, because persistence is never merely given. A difference that does not persist is only a contrast in a single frame, a transient imbalance that disappears as soon as the world mixes, a Boltzmann brain that flickered into existence without purpose and dissolved before it could ask why. To exist across time is to resist being averaged away. The universe does not need a villain to erase you. Ordinary mixing is enough. Gradients flatten. Correlations decay. Edges blur. Every island of structure exists under pressure, and to remain an island is to pay a bill. This is the point where the philosophy of existence stops being a cloud of words and becomes an engineering problem. A boundary is not a metaphysical line drawn on reality. It is a mechanism. A boundary is anything that reduces mixing between an inside and an outside, anything that makes certain differences last long enough to matter. A cell membrane is a boundary. It admits nutrients, expels waste, and keeps the cytoplasm from dissolving into the surrounding medium. A skin is a boundary. It holds the organism together against a world that would otherwise colonize, desiccate, or disassemble it. Attention is a boundary in cognition. It selects what enters processing and what remains noise, what becomes signal and what stays background. Every boundary is a kind of selective permeability. It admits some flows, blocks others, and thereby stabilizes a distinction that would otherwise degrade. But boundaries are never free. The cell membrane is maintained by active transport. The skin is repaired by continuous cellular turnover. Attention is allocated and reallocated by mechanisms that themselves require energy and coordination. Maintenance is the verb hiding inside every noun that persists. The moment you say, "this continues to be," you are already talking about dynamics. Entropy is a word people either worship or reject. But here it needs no mythic status. All we require is the banal fact that in the absence of active constraint and work, distinctions blur, not because the universe is malicious, but because there are many more ways for structure to be scrambled than for it to be held. Heat leaks, noise, accumulates. The environment perturbs. The combinatorics are asymmetric. Maintaining a pattern is usually harder than breaking it. This is not a moral lesson. It is a structural one. The cost of persistence gives existence a direction. A stable thing is a thing embedded in a regime of ongoing correction. A boundary is the visible footprint of continuous labor against blurring. A static structure, seen honestly, is simply a dynamical equilibrium that has become so familiar we mistake it for stillness. In this universe, it has always been dynamics first, statics second, process before substance, verb before noun. Once you see this, a new kind of inevitability appears, not the melodramatic inevitability of fate, but the sober inevitability of constraints. Under constraints, not everything can happen. Under constraints, some forms are easier to maintain than others. Under constraints, some forms are easier to maintain than others. Under constraints, some sick actions reappear because they are the cheapest ways to keep distinctions intact. Consider the snowflake. No two are identical, yet all share the same hexagonal symmetry because the geometry of water crystallization under cold admits only certain growth patterns. The constraints do not determine every detail, but they carve the space of possibilities into a family of recognizable forms. Consider evolution stumbling toward eyes in dozens of independent lineages, not because nature wanted eyes, but because given light, motion, and survival pressures, sensing becomes valuable, and there are only so many workable design families. Consider the human condition itself, the recurring patterns of love and grief, ambition and resignation, the way every culture invents rituals for birth and death, the way every mind discovers anxiety, hope, shame, and wonder. These are not coincidences but attractors, the shape of what self-maintaining, self-aware systems tend to become when they navigate finite lives under constraint. Consider how independent thinkers, separated by oceans and centuries, converge on similar ideas when facing similar problems, how calculus was invented twice, how democracy was reinvented across cultures, how the same moral intuitions surface in traditions that never touched. Constraints carve attractors in the space of possibilities. The shape of existence is, in part, the shape of its constraints. But there is another pressure that emerges as systems become more sophisticated, the need to anticipate. A boundary that merely reacts to perturbations will eventually encounter a challenge it cannot survive, a threat that arrives faster than response time allows, a resource depletion that cannot be reversed once noticed, an environmental shift that punishes the unprepared. To persist in a world of delayed consequences and hidden causes, a system must do more than respond. It must predict. It must build, inside itself, a model of what lies outside, a compressed representation of the environment's regularities, its likely trajectories, its probable responses to intervention. This eternal model is not a luxury. It is a survival condition for any system facing uncertainty across time. The logic is inexorable. If the environment has structure, if certain states tend to follow other states, if certain actions tend to produce certain outcomes, then a system that captures that structure in advance can act preemptively rather than reactively. It can avoid the cliff before falling, seek the resource before starving, anticipate the predator before being caught. The better the model, the further ahead the system can see, and the more degrees of freedom it has in choosing its path. But the model must live inside the system, which means it must be smaller than the world it represents. The territory is always larger than the map. This is the origin of compression, not as aesthetic preference, but as existential necessity. The world model must be compact, because it is housed within a bounded system that is itself part of the world. This is where compression enters as more than a clever metaphor. To persist under constraint, a system must economize. It must represent what matters in a compact way, because resources are finite: time, energy, bandwidth, material, attention. Compression is the art of preserving distinctions while discarding irrelevant detail. It is the selection of representations that retain control-relevant structure at minimal cost. A genome is a compressed program for building and maintaining an organism. A nervous system is a compression engine that constructs a usable world model from sparse, noisy inputs. A scientific theory is a compression of phenomena into a small set of principles that generate many predictions. A habit is a compression of a learned policy into an automatic routine. Compression is not merely an aesthetic preference, it is an existence condition. A system that wastes resources on distinctions that do not matter will exhaust itself before the world is done testing it. The uncompressed alternative is not merely inefficient, it is unsustainable. Over time, under pressure, persisting structure tends toward compression because the alternative is dissolution. Inevitability in this sense is the convergence produced by resource-bounded maintenance. Notice what this does to the relationship between physics, life, and mind. The same general story, distinctions, boundaries, maintenance, constraint, compression, applies at every level, but the boundary mechanisms become more sophisticated as systems internalize the work of persistence. A rock is an island of structure whose persistence is mostly a gift of molecular bonds and environmental stability. A flame is an island of structure that persists only through continuous throughput. It is a process with a boundary that exists because fuel and oxygen flow in and heat flows out. A cell is an island of structure that actively repairs itself, manages its gradients, and uses energy to keep itself far from equilibrium. An organism is an even larger island, coordinating many boundaries and maintenance processes in hierarchies. A brain is an organ whose maintenance strategy includes something new, internal models. Rather than merely resisting blurring at the skin, the nervous system resists blurring at the level of prediction and control. It builds a latent state, a compact internal configuration that stands in for the world and for the body's needs. It updates that latent state, moment by moment, to keep behavior adaptive. And then something further happens. The model begins to model itself. A smaller, meta-level representation emerges, a compressed image of the system's own states, its own tendencies, its own boundaries. This is where self-awareness enters, not as a mystical addition, but as a recursive fold in the modeling process. The system that predicts the world must eventually predict its own responses to the world, and to do that, it must represent itself as an object within its own model. It is here, in the internalization of maintenance into representation and self-correction, and in the further internalization of the representer into the representation, that consciousness becomes not a mystery, but a natural next step in the causal story. Latent state is a technical phrase with a human consequence. It means that what governs a system's next move is not identical to what you can directly observe. A thermostat has a trivial latent state, perhaps a single bit, heat in on or off, and a few thresholds. A brain has an astronomically complex latent state, a high-dimensional configuration that binds together sensory evidence, memory, goals, affective valuations, predictions, and action readiness. You never see that state directly. You see its projections, speech, movement, attention, the contents of thought. The claim of this book is that the texture of conscious experience is what it is like to be the locus of that latent dynamics, what it is like to be a system whose persistence depends on continuous model updating under constraint. The interior is not an ornament, it is the lived signature of a particular style of self-maintenance. This is the point where many readers expect an argument that consciousness is explained away, reduced to mechanics. That is not what is on offer. The proposal is a stricter kind of unification, that the same phenomenon admits two descriptions that must remain coupled. From the outside, a brain is a dynamical system performing prediction and control under resource constraints. From the inside, that same process is felt as experience. The goal is not to deny the inside, but to make it legible as structure. When the latent state updates smoothly and successfully, the world feels coherent. When it fails to settle, the world feels uncertain. When control is cheap, life feels fluent. When control is expensive, life feels effortful. When the system predicts safety and opportunity, affect turns warm and expansive. When it predicts threat and loss of control, affect turns tight and urgent. These are not poetic coincidences. They are the interior correlates of dynamical regimes. Affect is often treated as the irrational color thrown over real cognition. But in a system whose existence depends on maintenance, affect is not optional. It is a control signal. It is the body and brain's way of assigning value and urgency to distinctions, of marking what matters for survival and integrity. Pleasure and pain, attraction and aversion, calm and dread are not arbitrary decorations. They are compressed summaries that steer behavior when full computation is impossible. If you had to deliberate from scratch about every step, you would not survive long enough to deliberate. Affect is one way the system makes the world actionable by carving a small set of priority gradients into an overwhelming space of possibilities. When you feel desire pulling you forward, you are feeling a gradient in state space. When you feel anxiety tightening your attention, you are feeling a boundary being drawn more narrowly around what the system believes it must control. When you feel shame, you are feeling a social boundary threatened, an anticipated loss of standing, access, belonging that the organism treats as existentially relevant, because for a social primate it often is. The language of texture begins to pay rent here. It lets you describe feelings not as vague moods but as forms of constraint and control experienced from within. Examples matter because they prevent this vocabulary from floating away. Consider the difference between walking on firm ground and walking on ice. The external situation changes, but so does your interior. On ice, the world feels sharper and more precarious. Your attention narrows. Your movements become deliberate. The cost of error rises. You sense your body as an object requiring monitoring. The texture of experience is different because the control problem is different. The latent state must allocate more precision to balance and prediction. The system tightens boundaries around action. It reduces exploratory motion because exploration is expensive. Or consider being in a conversation where you feel socially safe versus one where you feel scrutinized. In safety, your mind roams. You improvise, you listen openly. Under scrutiny, you rehearse, you second-guess, you feel time pressure in every silence. The environment has changed in a subtle social way, but the internal control regime has changed dramatically. In one case, the boundary between self and other is permeable. In the other, it is fortified. In one case, meaning is diffuse. In the other, it is concentrated in a few loaded distinctions: how you appear, how you are judged, what a misstep would cost. These are not just emotions, they are geometries of constraint. If experience has shape, we should be able to talk about dimensions of that shape without collapsing into arbitrary lists. Throughout this book, you will see recurring axes that organize the felt world. There is valence, the basic orientation toward approach or avoidance. There is intensity, the amplitude of activation. There is clarity, the felt precision or uncertainty of the internal model. There is agency, the sense of controllability, of being able to steer outcomes. There is temporal horizon, the extent to which the system is dominated by immediate demands or long-range pulls. There is friction, the felt cost of control, ranging from fluent flow to grinding effort. There is social permeability, the openness or guardedness of boundaries around self. There is meaning density, the degree to which the world is filled with loaded distinctions that matter. You do not need to memorize these as doctrine. You need only notice that they recur because they are the experiential faces of the control problem. A moment, a mood, a personality, even a culture can be described as typical trajectories through this space, typical basins of attraction, typical ways of allocating maintenance. The self in this framework is not a ghost at the controls, but a boundary in time. It is a maintained distinction, a way the system keeps its history, its commitments, its body, its social identity, its values coherent enough to function. Your name, your memories, your preferences, your fears, your sense of what you would never do, these are not merely stories you tell. They are stabilizing constraints that reduce the degrees of freedom of your future. A self is a policy with inertia. That inertia can be liberating because it makes action possible. It can also be imprisoning because it makes change costly. When people speak of identity crises, they are not indulging in drama. They are describing what it feels like when a boundary that used to hold no longer holds, when the latent state cannot compress the world into a coherent narrative, when prediction fails at the level of who I am, and the system must pay the expensive bill of reconstructing itself. Again, this is texture as structure. A crisis is a dynamical event, not a mere mood. At this point, a skeptical reader may ask why any of this matters beyond a clever synthesis. The answer is that a vocabulary that unifies existence, life, mind, and experience changes what you can do with your own consciousness. If you treat your feelings as irrational ghosts, you will either obey them blindly or suppress them blindly. If you treat them as signals in a maintenance system, you can interpret them, calibrate them, and sometimes redesign the constraints that generate them. You can begin to ask questions that are both intimate and technical. When you are anxious, what boundary is tightening, and what does the system believe is at risk? When you procrastinate, what is the predicted cost of engagement, and what competing attractor is offering cheaper immediate regulation? When you feel numb, what has flattened the gradients of meaning, and what maintenance processes have been throttled? When you feel alive and in flow, what constraints have aligned so that control becomes cheap and feedback becomes clean? These questions are not therapeutic platitudes. They are operational diagnostics. They treat experience as a structured phenomenon you can learn to read. The ethical consequences also become clearer when you see experience as maintenance under pressure. If suffering is not merely a narrative label but a regime of high-cost control, tight boundaries, urgent gradients, low agency, relentless meaning density in the form of threat, then compassion is not merely sentiment. It is an attempt to reduce unnecessary control cost in other systems like ourselves. If dignity is a kind of boundary integrity in social reality, then humiliation is not merely hurt feelings. It is boundary violation that forces expensive reconstruction. If a society is a network of maintained distinctions, laws, norms, institutions, then justice is not an abstract ideal, but a stable maintenance strategy that prevents the system from consuming its own members as fuel. This does not magically solve ethics, but it grounds moral language in structural language. What kinds of boundaries should be protected? What kinds of constraints should be imposed? What kinds of maintenance burdens are legitimate to offload onto others? What kinds are cruelty? All of this returns us to inevitability, but in a way that should now feel less like prophecy and more like physics. When you understand that persistence requires maintenance, and maintenance is resource-bounded, and resource-bounded systems are forced into compression, you begin to see why certain forms reappear. Minds that can predict and control will tend to evolve in worlds where prediction and control pay. Systems that can represent self as a stable boundary will tend to outcompete systems that cannot coordinate their own future. Social structures that distribute maintenance burdens more sustainably will tend to persist longer than structures that cannibalize their members. None of this is guaranteed in a simplistic way. History is noisy, contingency is real, but the space of possible histories is carved by constraints, and within that carved space, convergence is common. The deeper the constraint, the more stubborn the attractor. The more expensive the maintenance, the more selection favors efficient, compressed strategies. Inevitability here is not a story about destiny. It is a story about the geometry of possibility under cost. The remaining task of this book is therefore not to persuade you with rhetoric alone, but to give you a reader's method, a way to look at any phenomenon, an organism, a habit, a relationship, a moment of fear, a flash of beauty, and ask with increasing precision what distinctions are being sustained, what boundaries are doing the sustaining, what maintenance is required, what entropic pressures threaten it, what constraints carve the dynamics, what compression makes it possible, and what the resulting texture feels like from within. If you do this with patience, a remarkable inversion happens. The old split between objective reality and subjective experience begins to feel artificial. Experience becomes not less real, but more precisely real. It becomes a lawful thing, variable, high-dimensional, difficult to measure, but structurally continuous with everything else that persists in a universe that blurs. This introduction has deliberately moved across scales because the book's central claim is cross-scale. The shape of experience is not an isolated curiosity inside the skull. It is the interior face of the same causal story that makes boundaries, organisms, storms, and societies. It is what self-maintaining structure feels like when the maintenance is performed by prediction and control, and when the boundaries include not only skin but attention, identity, and meaning. The chapters ahead will sharpen each term until it can be used without hand-waving, and they will return repeatedly to concrete examples, because the only way to believe a unifying vocabulary is to watch it work across domains. If the wager is correct, you will finish not with a new set of slogans, but with a new perceptual skill, the ability to sense, in your own life, the dynamics of distinction and maintenance that you have always been living, and to recognize that your most private textures are not outside the universe's causal structure, but among its most intimate expressions.